there in Egypt, requesting that he withdraw. And when Antiochus sought time to consider, he wanted time to consider his options, Popilius famously drew a circle around him in the sand, and he demanded that he give him an answer there and then. I want your answer now. Otherwise you can consider yourself at war with Rome. Now, what is a good self-respecting Seleucid to do? You go away. That's what you do. You go away at that point, and he did. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he lost heart. But by golly, he was mad. And at the appointed time, there you go, ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, he'll lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favour to those who break the Holy Covenant. And that's what he did. You won't let me have a go at Egypt, but you won't care if I have a go at those people in the middle. So he went back to Jerusalem. His armed forces, it says, will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. They will set up the abomination that causes desolation, which was effectively the image of Zeus in the temple. He put up the image of Zeus and said, you're going to worship that. And with flattery he will corrupt those who are violent. Imagine the thing, many of the Jews, wanting to save their skin, decided, yes, we'll suddenly convert to everything Grecian. And of course the faithful vigorously opposed it, and they got killed. In fact, I forget the figures. The figures were astronomical. The number of people who are either killed or sold into slavery or whatever. I mean, we're talking, I don't think it was hundreds, but it was certainly tens of thousands. And it all happened in a very short period of time. And basically the reason for it, Antiochus was mad. He was so cross that the Romans turned him back from Egypt that he just had to let loose. And I think there is another approach to Daniel 11 which you probably haven't heard of before, but which I think makes more sense. Now, whether it sort of clarifies our overall view of prophecy or not is another thing altogether. I mean, we might be taking a step backwards here in some respects, in the sense that we might be complicating the whole thing. I'm not sure, but just I want to put this proposal on Daniel 11 to you, see what you think. And then we'll move into chapter 12 and hopefully round off what we've got to say about Daniel tonight. Now, this is chapter 11. All the slides won't be as detailed as this, but let's just read these relevant verses through from verse 36. You remember in Daniel 11, we have most of it from verses pretty much up to verse 1 to 35. We've got this constant narrative about the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north was basically the relevant king of the day of the Seleucid kingdoms based up in Syria. And the Seleucid empires, remember, came out of the Greek Empire. And there were various Seleucid kings, and perhaps the most infamous of all was Antiochus Epiphanes, and we saw what he did. And chapter 11 talks about Antiochus and all those things. And then we had the king of the south, which was another one of those four branches of the Grecian kingdom of Alexander. And that was originally set up by one of his generals, Ptolemy, and from there the Ptolemaic dynasty came down. And you had various Ptolemy kings, the kings of the south. And the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they kept fighting each other, and Israel was in the middle. It was in the middle and got squeezed most of the time. It was a bit like Poland in between Russia and Germany. Always got sort of squeezed in the middle. And the chapter 11 of Daniel, it continues in some quite remarkable detail. What we call it's a continuous historic thing. There's no question about that. It just outlines what's going to happen from the time of Daniel right through up to the time of, well, time of the end of Antiochus Epiphanes. It even covers a bit of the time of the Maccabees and so on. And everyone's been a little puzzled at the fact that from about verse 36 of chapter 11 there seems to be a gap. There seems to be a gap because suddenly verse 36 talks about a new character, a character called the King. And people say, well, which king are we talking about here? Previously it's been quite specific, either the king of the north or the king of the south, but here it seems to be a new character altogether. Let's just read what it says. The king, from verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them he will honour a god of fortresses. A god unknown to his fathers he will honour with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honour those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle. And the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. And he will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Ethiopians in submission. But reports or tidings from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. And there ends chapter 11 of Daniel. And so that raises a number of issues for us, issues that we briefly looked at last time. Who is or are the persons behind the pronouns? I mean, if we go back here from verse 40, halfway down there, you say, at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him. Hey, which him's that? Is that the king of the north? Oh, it couldn't be the king of the north, and the king of the north, so the him, it seems to be the king. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage the king, from verse 36, whoever that is, in battle, which seems to be, although it might, of course, that him might be referring back to all the things that took place before verse 36. It might actually be talking about the king of the north, back from prior to verse 36. And there's nothing in the text, there's nothing in the grammar that indicates who that pronoun him there in the beginning of verse 40 is. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him. Him. Which him's that? King of the north or the king? I mean, if you just read it through in English, you say, well, it looks like the him, the king of verse 36. That's the way we'd read it in English. But it could be referring back to the king of the north in the earlier verses, if you see what I mean. So we said that who is or are the person or persons behind the pronouns? Is the king in the middle, the king of the north, sometimes one, sometimes the other? And there's not a lot really to help us in all this. Now, what has caused most commentators to say that there must be a gap between verse 35 and the beginning of that passage that we read from verse 36 is the fact that they've been unable to find anyone among the successors of Antiochus Epiphanes who even remotely fits the description of the king from verse 36. Antiochus Epiphanes, with all the dreadful things he did to the Jews, he was about 170, 165 thereabouts BC. And after him, the Seleucid kings kept going for about another 100 years. But frankly, they went downhill, really. There was no outstanding king and no nasty king either, really, who came after Antiochus Epiphanes. They were all a bit ho-hum, really. No one reached the depths of wickedness that he did. No one to write home about at all. So that's one of the difficulties. And then, of course, if we try to fit all this into a last day context, we get into troubles like, you know, this person, king, whoever it is, king of the north, king in the middle or whatever, attacks Egypt for all the riches and the treasures of Egypt. And you look at Egypt today and say, well, goodness me, that hardly applies. And then you've got people like Harry Whittaker saying, oh, but it's all to do with the Aswan Dam or something. No, it just doesn't cut it, I don't think. I mean, Egypt is a basket case today. You wouldn't invade Egypt for its riches and treasures, it hasn't got any. And then people say, oh, the Suez Canal, doesn't do it for me. I don't know. So where do we go from here? Well, that's what's caused the problems. Most commentators say, well, it's got to take us right through to the end time in some way, because there's been no one among the successors of Antiochus Epiphanes who even remotely fits that description. But what if the agreed continuous historic approach of the earlier part of the chapter had not